Hi, everyone. We are delighted to introduce Jayant Bhandari, who is constantly traveling the world to look for investment opportunities, particularly in the natural resource sector, and advises institutional investors about his finds. Today, we are delighted he took the time to present to us from Latin America on where Latin America is going. Jayant, the floor is all yours, my friend.
Great. Thank you very much, Renee. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk about Latin America's future as I see it, based on a portrayal of a series of countries in Latin America. What I want to do is to glean out certain underlying factors that seem very common across Latin America, and how those factors will combine in the future to affect the future of Latin America. Let's talk about Cuba. Cuba has been controlled by these two thugs, these two tyrants, the Castro brothers, for the last 62 years or so. And they have run a regime of tyranny and oppression in Cuba, including bringing the world to a third world war at a certain point of time. But these people have run a communist regime for the last 62 years, and this continues to be among the rare communist regimes in the world today. Now, so crooked have been the Castro brothers that the earlier ruler of Cuba, the Batista, is seen as a right-winger today, is seen as a free marketeer. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. Batista was quite a socialist himself. He himself was a tyrant. He ran a very oppressive regime himself. And he was supported by Democratic Socialist Coalition, among which was the Communist Party of Cuba. Batista was no free marketing saint. In fact, he was hand in glove with the mafia, and he expropriated private properties in Cuba and sold those off to foreigners. Again, however, given the totalitarian, ultra-tyrannical regime that Cuba today has, Batista from far afar looks like a free marketeer and a right-wing libertarian, which is completely untrue. Now, Cuba has been facing a lot of protests over the last few months. This has been something very unique. These protesters seemingly came out for liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity. This has been seen as something very courageous by the protesters, because it's now believed that Cubans are waking up. My question is, are they? They have, as usual, used this slogan, liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity. Now, human beings at least should have learned in the last 220 years of history that this slogan is hollow. It means absolutely nothing. And if at all it means something, it means the exact opposite of what it claims to be. When protesters and activists over the last 200 years, in every single revolution, in every single activism that you have seen, when they talk about liberty, they don't mean what philosophically liberty means. To them, these activists and revolutionaries, liberty means freedom and liberty from self-responsibility. They want liberty to have as much resources as they want to get, even if that means those resources need to be stolen from someone else. When these protesters want fraternity, they aren't really looking for brotherhood at all. What they are solely focused on is materialism and hedonism. They want to acquire as much of resources as they can for themselves. Now, in a certain way, they certainly want egalitarianism, but that is mostly by cutting the feet of wealth generators and destroying their wealth generating capabilities, impoverishing not only the wealth generators, but themselves as well. So one has to be very careful about this hollowed out, empty, deceptive slogan. Now, I was going through a series of articles on Cuban protests, the recent protests in Cuba, to glean out what the mainstream media was saying and what the audience was perceiving as happening in Cuba. This one says that simply unprecedented. It is without a doubt a watershed moment in the history of Cuba. As if Cuba has changed its course completely, and as if the future of Cuba is going to be completely different from what it has been for the last 62 years or longer. Now, the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, that no society actually faces a watershed moment. I have never come across a society in the last 2,000 years of human history where something triggered a complete change in a society. Societies are like Titanics. They move very slowly and change very slowly. And usually it's impossible to predict a better future of a society. If at all, what you can predict is a worse future of a certain society. However, these kind of statements by opinion writers in newspapers and the mainstream media and the audience sound very good. It's very romantic, and it goes along with the politically correct environment that we exist in today. This one says, this author says that these protests have been the biggest and most radical expression of discontent in a 62-year process, which actually is true. But the reason why people have protested on the street is not because they want liberty and fraternity and egalitarianism. The reason they have protested is because shops have run out of food and medicine in Cuba. And people are hugely frustrated that the free stuff that they have become accustomed to isn't coming anymore to them. Now, the US gets the blame for the embargo in Cuba and for the high prices on food and medicine, but that is a completely inappropriate blame that the US gets, because US does not impose embargo on medicine and food. The reason food and medicine has run out of shops in Cuba is because the government of Cuba imposes a massive profit margin on reselling the food and medicine that they have imported in Cuba. So again, these protesters are not there for liberty. They are there for continuation of the free stuff that they have become habitual of. Now, this statement by another author in the media says that the communist control has expropriated control of capital within the hands of a few government-run corporations, leaving alone the Cuban population to suffer. Now, this is perfectly fine, but this is, again, virtue signaling in which authors like to segregate the government from the population and then pass all the blame on the government. And it's a good politically correct way of addressing a problem, because when you blame a culture or a society, then you are not seen as multicultural or accepting of diversity. The reality is that governments are nothing but symptoms, the tip of the iceberg of the culture of the society. You can't really have a government that is too different from the underpinning culture of a society. The problem such kind of governments come to exist is because population, while they claim to want liberty and freedom, or themselves have attitudes of tyranny in which they want to impose their own views on other people. And when you add that up, you have a tyrannical government. And that is what Cuba is. Now, this is another interesting statement I read. It said that these protests are rooted in an enduring tradition of resistance, dissent, and opposition. Now, I don't know where these authors get their views from, because the resistance, dissent, and opposition that you see in Cuba is mostly about getting more free stuff and liberty from self-responsibility. So again, this sticks very well on in the mainstream media and the audience that listens to the mainstream media, because they want to feel romantic about the world. But this is, again, a very deceptive and fake statement. Now it gets worse and worse as I change my quotes. But again, although I'm talking about Cuba, this is pretty much the underpinning factor in Latin America. This one says that what we have seen has been a generational shift. Younger people have have asked for freedom and have made it their own. And they have the passion. Now, the reality is that after 2 or 3 generations of communist rule, I doubt if Cubans really understand what liberty means. Whatever minor amount of liberty that they understood at a certain point of time, 62 years back, has got erased from their minds over the last 62 years. So again, these authors who haven't really spent some time in Cuba, who haven't really understood the local culture, want to say what sticks in the minds of the audience without really caring for whether they are talking what is factual or what is the truth. I'm currently in a Latin American country, and I've been to Latin America 4 or 5 times in the last 1 year. And then, of course, this is the most evergreen virtue signaling statement. And whenever you read anything like this, you should just bin those kind of articles. This article says that these protesters are darker, people of color, of course, and women. And this makes us all so romantic and so full of hope for the world. But again, this is a fake and deceptive statement from another author talking about Cuban protests. And now, if you really, really want to understand the destiny of Cuba, you realize that Cubans are driven by hedonism and materialism. There is a serious lack of moral spine in that country. And that is not just the case today. It was a similar situation 62 years back, or even more past than that. Most of the infrastructure that you see in Cuba today was actually built by Spanish and up to the time of Batista. The problem is that when you don't have a moral spine, the civilization, the society just falls away because there's nothing that keeps the institutions together. Now, I have to keep repeating this again and again. I'm not against pleasure. I'm not against people having a good time and having access to the material. But if that is the only focus the people have, if that is the only focus that those who run the institutions have, then everything must fall apart. And that is where Cuba stands today. It is a society that believes in nanny government. And as a result, Cuba's future will be anything between what Batista was like and what Castro's brothers have been like. And in fact, I might even contend that the next president, the next ruling regime in Cuba will be worse than Castro brothers. Liberty in such a population will always be a myth. And anyone who tells you that liberty is coming in Cuba is fooling you. Let's talk about Venezuela. And all I'm doing is talking about different societies in Latin America to provide the same factors that underpin these countries. Venezuela has been ruled by this, what I might call a moron, Maduro, who has been running that country into the ground. He has created a humanitarian disaster, which has meant that millions of Venezuelans have left the country for the neighboring countries, which are not much better off, but those people have had no choice. He was appointed as the head of the government by another ignoramus, Hugo Chavez, who was, of course, a follower of Castro. A lot of leaders in Latin America have been followers of Castro, and they have learned and implemented terrible economic regime and structure on their societies. Juan Guaido is the new guy on the scene. He claims to be the president of Venezuela, given how last elections were held, and apparently he should have become the president. But this is how he's treated on the street in Venezuela. despite the fact that several other countries have recognized him as the president of Venezuela. But you don't really have to go much deeper. Look at the parliament of Venezuela to understand what Venezuela is destined for. Guaido is no free marketeer himself, and there's no evidence that under his presidency, things would change any substantially compared to what has been happening in Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro. So again, there isn't much hope from Venezuela. Now, I work in the investment area, and I have a lot of friends. When I travel with them, they often tell me that all people around the world want to progress and become prosperous, and they want to give the best future for their children. And the same people then think that because they assume one thing, which is that everyone wants to become prosperous. And then they assume the second thing, that these people would then know what is the right thing to do, and then they would do the right thing. So they make a few assumptions which look very logical to rational people. It flows this myth, which I call a myth, flows very well, and it sticks among smart, good, compassionate, tolerant, high IQ people. But the reality is very different. What looks rational to one looks completely idiotic to another. And all you have to do is to look at what's been happening in Afghanistan or sub-Saharan Africa or many hellholes around the world. The reality is that people have a habit of doing more wrongs to correct prior wrongs. And this is the reason why in today's world, today's technology, with today's kind of understanding we have about how to produce wealth, we still have poverty and hunger around the world. Half of the world probably goes to sleep without full stomach today. Even today, when hunger should have been eradicated about 100 years back. Venezuela, ladies and gentlemen, will continue to do more wrongs. Even if Guaido comes into power, it will continue to do more wrongs to correct prior wrongs, because that is how they think. Now, doing more wrongs to correct prior wrongs shows you in this chart, the GDP per capita of Venezuela has been cut by about 80% in the last 1 decade. That is how people trying to correct the negative course of their growth by taking actions, by making it continuously negative. And that's where Venezuela is today, more poor than it was 40 or 50 years back. Here is the underlying principle. Societies driven by materialism and hedonism. If the society does not have a natural moral elite that controls the institutions, civilization must fall away. And that is the problem with Latin America. Let's talk about Colombia. Colombia has seen consistent, chronic, acute protests over the last several months. Scores and scores of people have died in these protests. Why are they protesting? Because the government wanted to impose a new tax on the people. And I'm all for them, all with them. Taxes should be reduced. In fact, taxes should go away because they are involuntary. And I'm all with them about reducing taxes and not imposing new taxes. But these protesters don't want new taxes, but they want government to increase social welfare. Now, of course, Colombians, these protesters at least, are very bad with mathematics. They don't really understand that you can't reduce taxes and at the same time increase public expenditure. Colombia has a decades-long history of far-left extremism, insurgency. This society has suffered hugely from crime and a massive amount of leftist insurgency. But if you look closer to views of Colombians, you realize that the kind of nutrients, the negative nutrients that they produce because of their materialism and hedonism, and the fact that they are not rooted in moral principles, must mean that this country is destined to be ruled by tyrants and must suffer the consequences of leftist insurgency. Many people think of Latin America as a Western country, a Western part of the world, which is completely wrong. Just because Latin America is in Americas does not mean it is, you can equate it with Canada or the US or with Europe. And just because 80 to 90% of Latin Americans claim to be Christians and even Catholic, does not mean that they understand the concept of Bible. As I said, I'm in Latin America. This is my 4th or 5th visit to Latin America in the last 1 year. The fact is that Christianity in Latin America is voodoo. It's packed with pagan rituals and superstitions. And they clearly don't understand the 10 Commandments. And it's a very envious society, very materialistic and hedonistic society. So again, as I said, Latin America lacks the moral structure to keep this society together as a civilization. Let's talk about Peru. Peru has just elected a Marxist as its president. This Marxist, Castillo, wanted to originally nationalize the mining industry, nationalize other major industries. And the only experience Castillo has is that he was for 28 years a primary school teacher. He does not have a real life experience of how the economy should be run. Now, I shouldn't be complaining about it because my own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, was only a substitute teacher with a couple of years of experience. And he ended up becoming the Prime Minister of Canada. So if Canadians could be so naive and simplistic, what's wrong if a backward country, Peru, elects a Marxist? And I take that, that comment positively. But a lot of my friends tell me that Castillo, although he is a Marxist, cannot get away with implementing his Marxist policies. The reason is that the Congress is going to go against him. He does not have enough political power to implement his Marxist policies. And again, I completely agree with that. But the fact remains that Latin American countries have a habit of going one step forward and 2 steps backward. Let's finally talk about Chile. Chile has been among the most prosperous Latin American countries, one of the sanest Latin American countries. A good friend of mine who moved from Canada to Chile about 10 years back has just run away from Chile. Why? Let's talk about what options you have in Latin America. Again and again, it is in Cuba, it has been the option between Batista and Castro brothers, 2 extremes of tyrants. You don't have a sane option in Latin America. Similarly, in Chile, you had the option, and you have the option to choose someone like Pinochet or Allende. You don't really have that perfect utopian option that you might have in mind. With Pinochet, what happened was a few thousand people, perhaps a few tens of thousand people faced extrajudicial killings. And there's nothing that is disputable about it. He did kill a lot of people. He also put that country on the path to progress. He made Chile one of the most prosperous and rich countries in Latin America and even among the world. And he underpinned that country's institutional structure with a constitution that gave a lot of private properties rights to its citizens. Now look at the other option you had, who was Allende, against who Pinochet ran a coup. And Allende was thinking of killing and butchering maybe 1 million people. He was a Marxist who was nationalizing the industry, who was implementing all across Marxist policies in Chile. So if you ask me, given that these are the only 2 options I have, my clear preference is for Pinochet. Now, these idiots you see in Chile are celebrating a vote that has gone in favor for a new constitution. A new constituent assembly has been elected, out of which 78% people in the constituent assembly are leftist, socialist, Marxist, or communist. So you can imagine what kind of constitution Chile will have next year. These idiots, of course, are celebrating the immediate benefit, the free stuff, the crumbs that will fall off from destruction of private property, which is what the new constitution will do. But that will also destroy the civilization, the institutions that Cuba was provided by Pinochet. And of course, I don't deny that was under the influence of the United States. So far, based on what I've said, it seems like Latin America has a red scare. Latin America is on a way to leftism, to socialism or communism. Is that correct? So far, so good, except that the reality is going to be much worse than what I have said so far. Let's, however, talk about the US first, just to show which direction Latin America is going to keep going into the future. The US has been the policeman of the world. Whether you like the US interference in the world or not, the fact remains that the US has always nudged Latin America in the direction of the free market capitalism. The US might not have so much supported democracy. It might even have gone against democracy. And I'm actually quite in favor of that. But it did the right job of nudging Latin American countries into the direction of the free market. And the reason is that until about the end of last century, the US believed in the free market. The US was a fan of the free market. And there are a lot of people in the United States who understand the moral basis of free market capitalism and how important it is to build a civilization and retain and maintain a civilization. But what has happened in the last 20 years, which you all see, is that at least the institutions of the United States have been infused by what we call woke people. Now, US, in my view, is still the best country on the planet with the most enlightened people on the planet. But at least in the institutions, in the city halls, in the provincial governments, in the federal government, the leadership has been infused with what we now know as woke people. These are the people who see mathematics as racism. These are the people who rationalize the fact that adults can grow up, look at themselves naked in front of the mirror and cannot know what sex that they have. There is a rise in moral relativism in the United States. People want free money and free food. Now remember, Marxists, fascists, Nazis, or capitalists believed in none of these things. Any of those people a century back would have culled what are known as woke people. Woke people are nothing but feral people devoid of any values. They have no ideology. They are actually just feral, devoid of value people. So this brings me to what I see as the future of Latin America. The natural instinct of Latin America is to go leftwards. They have the natural instinct to become socialist and communist. Without the US dominating or nudging Latin America, it would have already become Union of Bolivar socialist republics. It would have gone communist the way Russia, USSR did. The US, because it believed in the moral basis of free market capitalism, always was able to nudge Latin American countries in the direction of the free market until about the end of the last century. But that has completely changed because the political leadership, people like Biden and Harris, Kamala Harris, are woke people. They don't understand the moral basis of free market capitalism, and they will, going forward, nudge Latin America into the direction of becoming woke. Now, Latin America is naturally inclined to become woke because they don't want those boundaries. They want free stuff. They don't want limitations set by the free market, and they want the ability to acquire resources and wealth produced by other people. But as I said, when you become hedonistic and materialistic, civilization has a tendency to fall away, which is what will happen in Latin America. Latin America across the board will become increasingly unstable. People don't understand how important moral nudging that America did to the world was beneficial to keep the world stable. Latin America, as with the rest of the third world, will become increasingly unstable without a morally based America. American leadership is now woke, and hence the third world will, and Latin America will become woke with time. The cost of doing business will increase in Latin America, which is what matters to the audience here. The risks of doing business will increase. And I'm an investor. I still invest a lot in Latin America, but I will be looking for a higher upside when I invest in Latin America going forward, because it will become unstable. Interestingly, Canada and Australia are, of course, also becoming woke with time. They are probably much more woke than the United States is. But at the same time, because Latin America will become woke faster than Canada and Australia, public perception of the investment climate of Canada and Australia relative to Latin America will improve. Now, Africa couldn't get any worse. There's no hope I have from Africa, but at the same time, because it can't get any worse, African investment perception will improve relative to what will be happening in Latin America. And as a result, these three places will see more capital be getting invested. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. To quote quite a few of the attendees in the live chat, amazing presentation, incredible talk, very insightful. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're a little over, but do you want to answer a couple quick questions?
Of course, absolutely.
So the first one, are there any Latin countries you see bucking this trend and possibly going in the right direction?
I don't think so. My view is that Argentina and Paraguay and Uruguay are probably going to be among the best places. And the southern part of Brazil, if it somehow gets separated from Brazil, might have some hope. But the problem is the leadership element. America, until the end of the last century, provided leadership. We have a tendency to believe that democracies of these countries keep these countries free. The reality is that these countries have been relatively free because of the nudging and the moral hammer that America provided on these countries. And that moral hammer, that moral restraints that America provided are no longer there, because woke culture is feral culture, and that's what America is going to provide. So no, I don't have much hope from Latin American countries.
Okay. And then one more, what is your geopolitical outlook for mining companies in Peru, given the recent election results?
I invest big in Peru and advise my institutional clients to invest in Peru. But of course, the risks of investing in Peru have gone up. As I said, the new president is Marxist. He will not be able to implement his Marxist policies, but that does not mean that Peru is going to continuously become more and more Marxist. The next president might actually become more centrist, but then after the next will very likely become Marxist with more authority over the Congress. So you can expect Peru to become more and more Marxist. And when I invest in mining companies, I'm looking at a time frame of about 10 to 15 years. This is my investment is not going to get destroyed in 10 or 15 years, probably. So I can apply just a higher discount rate, expect a higher profit, recover my original investment as soon as possible. That is how I approach societies that are getting worse with time.
Thank you, Jayant. Well, we do have another presentation starting in about 1 minute, so that's as much as I can fit in today. But thank you so much for joining us today. This was a presentation we really needed here at the Money Show, and it was excellent.
Great. Thank you very much, Renee.
Thank you. You have a wonderful day.
You too. Bye now.